Hello, this is Jack Tutor of Attention Magazine. Welcome to Crucial Listening, the podcast where I speak to experimental musicians and sound artists about the 3 records that are important to them. My guest this time is David Grubbs, a musician, a writer, a university professor, a label founder a couple of times over, currently based in Brooklyn. And this is the second time I've interviewed David. The first was for my book on post-rock called Storm Static Sleep. David's association with post-rock is manifold in that he was in a band with members of Slint called Squirrel Bait. He also then got embroiled, that's not the right word, associated with post-rock through the transition of his own band, Bastro, who became known as Gasta del Sol after a point and embarked on this unmooring of rock music, this departure from the fundamental principles of rock music, and became this entirely different thing. I won't do them any justice trying to describe them anymore, so please go listen to Gasta del Sol. David since has released a lot of work solo, and he's got a new record actually coming out in September called Creep Mission, which is coming out on Drag City. So David is really fascinating to speak to. I think he presents some really vivid evocations of sound and his own experiences. So I think you're going to enjoy this one. As always, attentionmagazine.co.uk/crucial listening. That's where I'll put all the notes, all the links that you could want. And please go rate and review this podcast and all that kind of thing to help me conquer the iTunes charts. It's inevitable. So without further ado, here's my conversation with David Grubbs on Crucial Listening.
We each of us have the faintest idea, the most fleeting of successions of expressions.
Hello, David. Welcome to Crucial Listening.
Well, thank you so much, Jack.
Thank you for coming on. Now, as always, I've asked you to assemble a list of 3 records that you consider to be important to you, which you've managed to do even amidst what seems to me to be quite a busy period of assembling various projects in various forms of media. One of which is a collaboration with a drummer who I'm forever fascinated by in terms of what he's doing and the work that he's putting out, and that's Eli Kessler. So what have you been doing with Eli? I see that this collaboration has been kind of going on for a few years now. There's video documentation I see of your performances from like 2014. But what have you been doing with Eli, and what is this manifesting in?
Well, we've done a number of things. The new release is an album called One and One Less, and it's the first release on Ugly Duckling Press Records. Ugly Duckling Press is a Brooklyn-based publisher that primarily does poetry, some fiction, and they're starting a record label to release audio documents of literary works. So Eli and I collaborated on an exhibition at MIT in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 2014 called One and One Less, in which we were invited to do a performance in the gallery and to leave some residue of the performance in the gallery for a month. And we created a performance based on this long poem that I've been working on for a number of years. I made wall drawings based on it, and we collaborated on a sound installation. And so the LP that's just come out this month on Ugly Duckling Press Records, one side is a 20-minute performance of me reading with Eli playing drums, and the other side is 20 minutes of documentation of the sound installation.
And is the poem in question the very same one that's going to be released in book form now the audience is assembled?
Yes, yes. So that I have just turned in the corrected copy edited manuscript, and that's forthcoming from Duke University Press, which published Records Are in the Landscape, my first book, in April of next year, and it's called Now That the Audience is Assembled. And I one of the reasons why I wanted it to come out in the spring is that, for me, one of the best experiences of publishing Records Are in the Landscape was really taking it on the road after the book came out. I'm used to putting out records and then you tour, and I like putting out books and touring as well. So hopefully I'll be in the UK next summer, a year from now, doing readings and performances related to Now That the Audience is Assembled.
That's great. What I find really interesting is that you're working with Eli, and I was immediately fascinated with how that would come together. Where did the idea arise to bring Eli into the process of doing these performances?
Well, the invitation from the Contemporary Arts Museum at MIT came directly to me, and I always prefer working with other people, particularly on installation or exhibition works. I've done the occasional sound installation, but I don't know. I've found that I've enjoyed the process more. I've learned more. It's the result has been better when I've had the opportunity to work with other people. And I've played with Eli in a couple of improvised trios with Spencer Yeh and with Nate Woolley. And I very much liked his sound installation works that I'd seen. And it just seemed, I don't know, improvised settings are so hit and run. You show up just in time to plug in and play, and, then you have a drink afterwards and then you're done. And so the idea of developing something over the course of several months with him, seemed like a great opportunity to take.
I find it interesting, this combination of the poem and percussion as well. I mean, watching it, I was trying to speculate in my head as to what kind of form that dialogue was taking. I mean, there were moments where I felt like Eli was kind of echoing certain syllabic patterns in what you were saying. I mean, does your relationship and execution of the poem, is there much variance in how that comes across depending on what Eli is doing? I mean, have you seen much change depending on the environment and the circumstances in which you're presenting it?
Yeah, I think Eli's playing has a huge influence on the tempo of the reading and what's emphasized in the reading. And all I can say is that it occurs with a kind of in the moment soft focus that you just hurtle headlong and try to make music out of it.
That's lovely.
I don't know. The other thing is, for that performance, I've tried different techniques. For that performance, I had a stopwatch and I read for 90 seconds and then I shut up for 30 seconds. Just to guarantee that there would be enough breathing space and that it wouldn't be suffocated with words. But I think the most recent time we performed it, I was able to slow it down and let there be more breathing room within the performance.
I must say, this poem is book length, isn't it? Essentially, in the final version, it's 130 pages. The prospect of putting together a poetic work, which I don't know, there's a looseness. I feel like in writing long form text myself, I cling to the sort of innate structure of written language, like with both hands as a means of dealing with the length. But I guess as soon as you get into poetry, that becomes less of a sturdy thing to cling on to, because it can go in so many different directions. I mean, how has it been to write such a long poetic work?
Well, the way that it works on the page is that the page is the basic unit. So it might look like a serial poem with comprised of 130 shorter poems. There is some enjambment that occurs across a page, but generally each page is a kind of self-contained idea or set of images. So literally, I just kind of worked on it page by page. I satisfied myself that a page was completed and polished, and then I moved on. And I also conceive of it as not so different from writing song lyrics. I never really wrote poetry because from the time that I was 13 or 14 years old, I was playing in bands and writing songs, and those kinds of impulses found their form in song lyrics. But song lyrics, for me, always remained miniatures, and they had that weird fate that they had to work in performance. They had to be sung. But, I feel like this is the longest song that I've ever written, or the long lyric that I've ever written, by a factor of about 500.
Well, congrats on getting to the final stage of that. So, as I've said, I've requested that you bring a selection of 3 albums that you deem to be important to you. And one question that I've found interesting to ask people, and the answer has always differed so drastically, is the process by which you came to the selection. I know that the guests so far have had varying degrees of torture involved in having it whittled down to 3.
Yeah.
How was it for you in picking those records?
It was relatively smooth. I thought that I didn't want any overlap, and that perhaps I would pick 3 different records that I came to at different times in my life.
And so that's what you've ended up with?
Yep.
Let's start with the first of the 3. I'll let you pick which one. And if you'd like to just as well describe briefly why it's important to you as well.
Sure. Why don't we take them in the order in which I encountered them? So Circle X's self-titled 4-song 12-inch EP from 1979 was a record that I heard probably in 1981 when I was 14 years old. And it's one of these records that, I guess I would say this about each of the records that I've picked, but I think it's so great that it should be bolted to the side of a spacecraft and sent out of our solar system. I listened to it again this morning. I think it's perfect. There's nothing that I would change about it. I think that it's as wild as the Stooges' Funhouse. I don't know. I wish that everyone in the world could hear this record.
And so they were from Louisville, is that right?
Yeah. So, I'm always struck by the kind of accidental quality of when people hear certain records, that are profoundly meaningful. What did it mean to hear this record for me in 1981 as opposed to if I had heard it for the first time 2 months ago? It really blew my mind. So they were from Louisville, but they'd already left Louisville by the time that I heard them. They'd left behind a lot of graffiti, which was incredibly impressive to me. As a 14-year-old, they had this very easily spray paintable Circle X logo that you would find spray painted around Louisville, or these flyers that they had pasted to walls that looked like they would outlive the walls themselves. The people in Circle X were, I don't know, probably 12 or 13 years older than I was. They had all gone to the Louisville School of Art. It's a kind of case in point for, I don't know, a kind of first generation post-punk, I guess you would call it, that comes from something other than a major metropolis.
Yeah.
That there really aren't obvious reference points. I mean, maybe like the Stooges in terms of the singing and the intensity. I don't know. I remember first hearing it and listening to it with Ned Oldham, who's Will Oldham's older brother, who was playing in hardcore bands around that time. And the only thing that he could refer it to was the very first Meat Puppets EP, which was this really kind of wild record. I think what I was struck by was the kind of intense distortion of the guitars, the fact that it was 2 guitars and there was no bass, so that even in the middle of all of this noise, there's a lot of space happening. And when I was listening to it this morning, I was thinking about the fact that in Gaster del Sol and when I was in the Red Crayola, generally there was not a bass player, and that there's something very satisfying about, very dense things happening with the guitars, very dense things happening with the drums, and this space between them. That you don't have the bass making logical sense of everything.
Yeah.
Getting rid of the bass in a punk band is a little bit like Ornette Coleman getting rid of the piano in a jazz quartet. That it becomes much more ambiguous, or, the chord changes really aren't even part of the program.
Yeah, I guess it's like an orientation device, isn't it?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So reading the responses to this material, I mean, I've had to sort of scrimp and salvage bits from YouTube and around the net to listen to this, and obviously that comes with the comments of people listening to it, most of whom were like, 1979, seriously. I mean, looking at it from, say, my perspective as someone who wasn't around at that time, it seems earlier than the bulk of material that perhaps this would have been considered to share kinship. I mean, was that it sounds from what you've said so far and the very sparse reference points that was the case at the time when you first heard it as well. I mean, was it something that kind of jutted out from your listening and your musical references elsewhere?
Yeah, it was absolutely wild. I mean, trying to make sense of this in the context of something like The Clash's "Give 'Em Enough Rope," which had, I probably heard for the first time right around the same time. "Give 'Em Enough Rope" was produced by Sandy Pearlman, who produced Blue Oyster Cult, and it's it's a very smooth, well-produced, well-played rock album. And at that time, I was reading things like Rolling Stone magazine, there were a number of writers like Greil Marcus who were trying to make the argument that the corrosive, critical, anarchic qualities of the wildest music from the late 60s was finding resonance in groups like the Gang of Four and the Clash. But I heard the Gang of Four and the Clash as being very polished productions, played extremely well, virtuosic in their own weird way. And then I heard something like Circle X, which really just had this quality of something hurled at a wall.
Yeah.
It still sounds totally wild to me. I don't know. I was cranking it this morning. I was loving it. And yeah, I feel like they were probably people, an art school band, people who picked up instruments that electric guitar and microphone and drum kit were just tools, and maybe not even, the tools that they were born to play. It was just something that they picked up at a particular point in time. When I first heard them, they had left Louisville in the dust, which was, as I say, deeply impressive. Like if you come from a medium-sized city and artists the generation in front of you, by words and deeds signify, we need to get the hell out of here and you need to get the hell out of here. That's really impressive. And they had moved also kind of insanely to Dijon, France, where this album was recorded. They were based in France for a little while, and then they moved to New York City, which it's a little more commonsensical. But yeah, they moved to France. I don't know. I think that they thought that their peers, as I say, were probably things like the Stooges, but also Rimbaud and Herman Nitsch. When I was listening to it this morning, I was thinking there's a Herman Nitsch recording from the late 70s. In which there's a German punk band that's part of one of these actions. And that's probably the closest thing that I can think of to compare, sonically, this Circle X record.
Wow.
If I were listening to this podcast, man, I would want to hear this thing.
Yeah. You're giving it a good sell, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
The Dijon thing's insane because I've read a couple of biographies and they just say Louisville, then New York. So I wonder if people dismissed that as a sort of Wikipedia Chinese whisper that
Right.
wasn't actually true, and just went, no, that can't be right.
No, I think they met someone maybe in New York who convinced them that he would be their manager and they should move to Dijon, France with him.
Wow.
Yeah.
What a diversion. And you actually re-released this record on a label that you had with Jim O'Rourke?
Yes, called Dexter's Cigar. So when we had the opportunity to put together a reissue label for Drag City, this was really at the top of our list.
Did you touch base with the guys themselves about re-releasing this record, and how did they feel about it coming back out again?
Yeah, I got in touch with Rick Latondra and Tony Pinotti, who were two of the four members. The group, they're actually playing a reunion show this fall, but they pretty much ceased to exist when Bruce Witzip, who was one of the founders, died in 1995. But yeah, I mean, Rick and Tony, what can I say? Like they're in it to win it. They're just I don't know, how do I want to describe it? They are who they are, and and proudly so.
And did you ever get a chance to see them perform live?
No, never did. Which is, I'm sure, one of the reasons why the record looms so large in my imagination. I mean, think of all of these bands that you saw that even if it was a good gig, some of the mystery was dispelled by seeing, who does what and how.
If I could get your second important record, that would be wonderful.
Okay. How about Tony Conrad's 10 Years Alive on the Infinite Plane, which, interestingly, was only commercially released within the last month.
Yeah.
But in 1994, I think, Tony came to Chicago at the invitation of Jim O'Rourke and Table of the Elements Records, and brought with him a number of recordings, unreleased recordings, one of which was a cassette of this piece, 10 Years Alive on the Infinite Plane, which was recorded in 1972 at the Kitchen in a trio with Tony playing violin, Reese Chatham playing long-stringed instrument, and Laurie Spiegel playing electric bass, this kind of adapted electric bass. And when Tony came to Chicago, we recorded a record called Slapping Pythagoras that Jim produced, that I played on, a bunch of our friends played on. And, Tony passed away about a year and a half ago, and he's really been on my mind. So I've been, thinking about Tony's music, and there have been a number of memorial events. So I've really spent a lot of time with friends of friends and kind of comparing notes and comparing the stories. So, I've really lived inside 10 Years Alive on the Infinite Plane for the last couple of months. I probably listened to that recently more than anything else. And Tony had brought a recording of it to Chicago because he thought that would be an easy thing to perform live. Slapping Pythagoras was this very elaborate recording with a section of 6 bowed electric guitars and lots of overdubs and things like that. But 10 Years Alive was performed very easily by a trio. So we did that a number of times with Jim playing electric bass and me playing the long-stringed instrument and Tony playing violin. And we made a recording of it in 1994. And there's actually a really beautifully shot film of it, I think also from 1996, from 2 years later. And some of that is in Tyler Hubby's Tony Conrad documentary. But anyway, it's one of these pieces that just, I can't imagine getting tired of it, because it already begins with this sort of like exhausted, existence on the infinite plane kind of feel about it. The one thing that I'll say about the piece, from Tony's instructions for Jim and me for playing it, is that so whoever's playing the electric bass, there's a steady pulse. It's only one note for the entire 90-minute performance. And the long-stringed instrument is a monochord that Tony built. It looks a little bit like a ski, like a downhill ski, with 2 strings on it and 2 guitar pickups, and you play it with a slide. And with the slide, you create upward-moving glissandi that always fade out before you arrive at this central pitch that the bass is pulsing on. So it's like it's this Sisyphean result where you're always moving towards the central point and never arriving there. And then if you feel that the time is right in the second half of the piece, after 45 minutes, you're permitted to do downward moving slides. But that was always a really tough decision for me to make. When do you reverse course?
Yeah.
In fact, in this long poem, and now that the audience is assembled, there's a long kind of reflection on a performance, where the composer sort of says, and now you can deviate from the score, and people are really freaked out. It's like, I don't know, is the time right?
Yeah. Hearing you describe it and the relationship between that bass and the long string instrument, I actually went on a run to this album the other day, and it was one of the worst runs I've ever done. And I think...
Oh, no, I thought you were going to say the bet that you ran for 90 minutes straight.
I think the lethargy of... not lethargy. Do you know what I mean? There's an atmospheric imposition there that's just like, just give up.
Yeah.
I obviously, the music itself is wonderful, but I did find this, probably out of everything I've heard from Tony, the most difficult, I think, the most uncomfortable record that I've listened to. Because actually, a couple of episodes back, I had Lasse Morag on the podcast, who picked Tony's collaboration with Faust as one of his records. That's much easier to run to, and I could definitely go forever with that one.
Yeah, that's a much more triumphant performance. This is a much more stoic one.
Yeah. And I read an essay that you wrote, I think, last year about your experiences with Tony, and what I found so amazing. I put on a screening of the documentary late last year, and there were so many stories and so many insights that I picked up from in that. Listening to Lasse talk about his experiences with Tony was, again, so enlightening, and reading your essay and finding out even more wonderful anecdotes about him, it's just been an absolute delight. I mean, what was it like working with him on Slapping Pythagoras and on these performances? How did you find him as a collaborator? Were you at ease, or what was the vibe like?
No, we were on our toes. It was sort of like having the world's funniest, smartest college professor. Who he'd have everyone laughing, and then the next minute he would say something that would just be so difficult to even make sense of. Yes, it was this kind of hilarious, almost like intellectually slapstick experience of being thrown off balance again and again and again. I don't know. He was just so fucking brilliant, but also so anti-authoritarian and so funny. I mean, such a kind of like crazed, creative, critical mind. No, you couldn't stop him. He really was, in all likelihood, the in terms of sheer kind of brain power, the most brilliant person I might ever have the opportunity to meet. And he just used that power for good. But because he was so goddamn funny and so weird. I loved him. Yeah. Amazing, amazing person. But also, I mean, when he showed up in Chicago in 1994, we had no idea what to expect. It wasn't like we'd seen a documentary film about him to prepare us for it, or a book about him to prepare us for it. He just fucking showed up, and, it was like, who is this weird, crazy, brilliant guy? And of course he was up for anything. So, like, Smog is playing at Lounge Acts. All right, take Tony to go see Smog, and then he embarrasses everybody by dancing like a crazy person. There's an Edison short, like one of the first films, is about taking Uncle So-and-so to the movies. And it's like this comedy, like this one-shot comedy about taking the crazy uncle to the movies. And the gag is that the crazy uncle thinks that it's all real. So, like when people are pulling out pistols on the screen, like in a Western, like he pulls out his gun and, like when the chorus line starts up, like he starts dancing and things like that. And, eventually he knocks down the screen. And that was kind of what hanging out with Tony was like in 1984. I also remember this hilarious interview in 1996 for Alternative Press, which was like a monthly music magazine, when the Table of the Elements Atrium Festival was happening. And it was like a group interview. And everyone seemed so serious about like talking about, what was important in their music. Jim and I were, like very serious about Gasper del Sol, or Bernhard Günther was very serious about his music. And all that Tony would talk about was like, Chicago seems very bike accessible. And if you moved to Chicago, you didn't have to have a car, and that would be great for the environment. And, like he was very focused on like, unlike Buffalo, Chicago really was a city where you didn't have to have an automobile.
Wow. I think, what was it I read? Something that really struck me recently was his method for picking out clothing was to select items that he couldn't understand the purpose of.
Yes.
Which is so nice and so liberated. I need to be very clear on the purpose of my clothing if I need to buy it. So that's the gulf between Tony and I.
Yeah. For some of the performances around the memorials, his widow, Paige, distributed a lot of his clothing. So I now have a lime green sports jacket and these lime green striped socks.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. I'll send you a photo of me in the lime green sports jacket.
There's a photo, did you say?
Yeah. I'll forward that to you.
Please do. That's going in the show notes.
Yeah.
I didn't realize you were involved in Slapping Pythagoras. I've listened to that record numerous times. And then during my research today, I was like, oh my God, I can't believe that I didn't realize this before. And in fact, I don't think I'd ever done any background on that record. I just listened, and suddenly there was this whole host of artists that I liked that were involved in the production of this piece. And so I'm fascinated to know from you the experience of recording that piece and being on the inside of that sound rather than on the end that I am, which, is just listening to the final product. What was it like being in the room with the sound of Slapping Pythagoras?
Well, the first thing that Tony did was put together this group of 6 guitarists bowing electric guitars, and he gave us really rudimentary rhythmic notation. He tuned everyone's guitars. He tuned the guitars to the noisiest amplifier in the room, so he just took a 60-cycle hum and tuned all the instruments. And I think he was really disappointed at our pathetic musical skills and how bad we were at reading notation and how shitty our bowing skills. It was me and Jim and Kevin Drum and a couple of other people. And I think he really thought like, I wanted real musicians for the, he was fine with it. But I think he was a little taken aback at, because he had a real musical training, as did Jim. But the rest of us kind of like rock guitar players, I think he was like, you guys are utterly abject and talentless. And still he rolled with it. And I don't know, he was kind of making up stuff on the fly. At a certain point, he decided that there should be a percussion track. So I play percussion on it. There was one take, it's like a 10-minute section where I play a pillow with Steve Albini's baseball glove, and an empty pint beer glass with a rolled up guitar cable, because he wanted a low sound and a high sound. So it just goes thud, ping, thud, ping for like 10 minutes.
If I could have your final important record, please, David.
Yeah, the third one is Luke Ferrari's Presbyterian number 1, which was released on Deutsche Grammophon in the early 1970s. The piece is dated 67 to 70. And I guess I've also been thinking about Luke Ferrari a lot. Luke Ferrari died, my God, how long ago now? What year is this? Did he die?
Oh, I don't know.
8 years ago, 9 years ago. It's weird because the day before we were recording this interview, Pierre Henry, who was probably the same age as Luke and like an old associate of Luke's, passed away yesterday. But I've been thinking about Luke a lot recently because his inspiration and some of his ideas figure into this long poem. And there's a character who's somewhat Luke Ferrari-like, or who at least speaks like Luke in the poem. And so I thought about Presbyterian number 1, which is this classic of field recording that's a very ambiguous piece that presents itself as just a microphone hung out the window overlooking a beach in Yugoslavia in the late 1960s. And so it's the sound of daybreak on the beach. And yet it's, at very minimum, probably 5 or 6 or 7 hours of the course of one day collapsed into a 20-minute edited recording, and it may be a number of days. And Luke was very mischievous and funny and cagey about that. And it's a piece that really kind of like broke things wide open in terms of music concrete and that tradition, in that prior to Presbyterian, or even prior to a lot of works of his, just before that, like Music Promenade, the ideal of music concrete had been to transform the concrete source such that you don't recognize the original source, right? That you're, as a listener, mentally cut off from the image of the source of the sound. And Presbyterian, I think a lot of people thought it was a kind of Dada prank at the time, but I don't know. It's one of these things that I come back to at least once a year, and I feel like it's never sounded more musical and more structured, and that the proportions among the sections are just right. And I don't know. It's one of these pieces that I keep coming back to because it seems so simple. It's probably seems so simple that a lot of people read about it and think like, got it, don't need to hear that. I don't know. Like it's really kind of a riddle for me. And Luke was one of these people who I just, respected so much and enjoyed any opportunity that I had to spend time with him. And as I say, because of this writing project, he's been very much on my mind. So Presbyterian, popped to the fore.
How did you end up meeting Luke, and when did you spend time with him?
I first met him in 1997, I was teaching at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago in the sound department, and I was a big fan of his work. I think that Jim had met him once in Paris at an Inagerum concert, and but yeah, I was a dyed-in-the-wool fan. And when I was teaching at the School of the Art Institute, it was this period where I think the Thicket had just come out. It's my first solo record. So I was teaching and touring at the same time. So I would teach something like 3 days a week and then be gone 4 days a week. And it was a total kind of breakneck period. And I, in terms of scheduling, lived very dangerously where, for example, if I taught at noon on a Monday, I frequently was flying back from gigs on Monday morning and just going from the airport directly to go teach.
Oh, my God.
Because I was 29 years old.
Yeah.
It just seemed like the thing to do at the time. And so one of these days I rolled in, from wherever, Winnipeg, at 11:30 in the morning, a half an hour before I was supposed to teach. And they said something like, didn't you get the email? You didn't respond to the email. Luke Ferrari is a guest in residence. I guess this was before social media. And you're supposed to introduce him and you're supposed to show him around. I was like, what?
Oh, my God.
So he really kind of appeared out of the blue. And so I spent a couple of days with him, squiring him around to, various talks and things like that in Chicago, and just totally hit it off with him. He was very patient because, my French was bad and his English got much, much better. But it was a little bit of a challenge to understand one another at the very beginning. But I reissued a number of his recordings. Every time I played in Paris, he and his wife Brunhild would come to the shows, and I played on a program of his in Chicago. I think that was just the one time, probably around 2000 or 2001. But anyway, he was somebody who I was just very, very happy to be able to observe working or to have a conversation with him.
Yeah, this is, I have to confess, the first time I've actually listened to this piece was on the back of you recommending it for this.
Uh-huh.
Which was really interesting because I've coming into this having heard so much field recording now, and was really struck by, I think, what you've already said. There's like a composition, like a structure which is really satisfying, and like a compositional depth. At one point I just was very intently observing just the placement of all of the sounds together and was like, this is just so nice.
Yeah,
there's something really lovely about it. I see you did a performance of some of Luke's pieces. I don't know how often you've done this, but one instance I found was in 2010 with Ensemble Pamplemousse. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that vaguely right. So how was the experience of actually performing some of Luke's pieces?
Terrific. So the main piece that I performed of Luke's is Tautologos 3, which I did in Chicago with an ensemble that included Luke. Did it in Japan a couple of years after that, and then in New York with Ensemble Pamplemousse. And Tautologos 3 is a text score that's just a series of instructions, and the most basic one is to come prepared with a gesture that you can replicate and that you repeat kind of on a loop. You determine the length of the silence between iterations of the gesture. And as it comes into contact or collision with other gestures, you slowly transform it. And it's meant to mirror that kind of sense of day in, day out, having the same routine that's just a little bit different from day to day. That, you run into the same person 4 out of 5 days in a row. It's a piece that I think comes out of and encourages reflection on larger loops within one's life and, habit and deviation from habit. I don't know. For me, it's a very, again, like a very kind of tremendously philosophical piece. just in terms of the instructions, I mean, it's really basic. You put together an ensemble. It shouldn't be, a solo or a duo or even a trio performance. I think like 6 or more players is good. And each person figures out a different length of their loop. And at least at the beginning, it's helpful to perform it with watches visible. And you do your gesture and you repeat it 25 seconds later or 19 seconds later or however many seconds you've agreed upon as the rest within your loop. And then it ultimately becomes an improvisation, but it's a very disciplined improvisation as you allow these kinds of collisions. Maybe your gesture is superimposed atop someone else's and it makes you change the dynamics of it. Or, you choose to change a pitch or, some aspect of the voicing but I mean, it's a piece that could be for movement alone. It could be for actor, like the score is very clear about this, that it's a tremendously broad, open-ended tool.
And how do you interact with those kind of things? Because I guess compared to a full-on free improvisation with no basis at all, I wonder if there's something nice about having the first paving slab laid down for you and being like, okay, hop on this and then you're away. Or this come prepared aspect, but it's just a kernel, it's just a small fragment that you come prepared with. It could be most anything. But you should just be able to repeat it exactly. And then in a kind of, you should have sufficient control over your instrument that, that you can change it very, very gradually. Right. It shouldn't be some, impossible sound sculpture thing that makes a different sound every time you do it, or I shouldn't pick up a trumpet, given the fact that I don't play the trumpet and would have a hard time reproducing the same thing and slowly transforming it. And one more question, I wanted to bring it back round to the record you've picked. Presque-Rien, is that the pronunciation? It's close, isn't it?
Presque-Rien.
Presque-Rien, thanks. I mean, I think you've spoken about why this record stands out for you as a piece of field recording. And I imagine, like myself, you've heard so much field recording since, and probably prior. And maybe you've already answered this question, but why is this the piece that you return to year after year as a piece of field recording that doesn't have that much editing applied to, well, it does have editing applied to it, obviously, but feels comparatively quite untouched to a lot of, as you say, musique concrète stuff? Why is this the recording that you return to?
I think both because it does have that quality of a field recording of something happened upon almost by chance, and yet through its compression of time, it feels very consequent and very purposeful. And also that there's something about, I remember listening to a recording of South Indian music with Jim O'Rourke around the time that Gaster del Sol started, where he said something like that he has a few recordings of traditional Indian music and he listens to them over and over again because he thought that rather than casting a wide net, I think this is a really interesting idea, that casting a wide net rather than hearing hundreds of different recordings of traditional Indian music, he felt that he would get closer to what was happening in it by listening to the same one again and again and again, and really kind of learning it from the inside. And I think that's a little bit of my attitude about Presque-Rien, that I could certainly never have to, I could listen to a lot of field recordings and never have to listen to the same one twice. And yet that there's really something to say about having selected one that you revisit on a regular basis.
Do you feel any increased pertinence of that right now? Because it kind of links in with something I've been thinking a lot about in that I am now so stranded in thoughts of not listening to quote unquote the right one when I have free access to listen to any number. And it's very tempting to become overly omnivorous to the point where you're ultimately consuming or tasting nothing as you're shoveling it down. Do you feel any greater attachment to that sentiment right now in our current climate?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like as a listener, I have to be a little more active in my choosing of the relatively limited amount of time that I have, or that anyone has, to selecting what you listen to. I mean, there's the incredible sense of listening to something for the first time, but also, I don't know, I mean, this is kind of what Records Ruin the Landscape is about. That there's something to be said about those repeated listens and those repeated listens at different points in the time span or the life of the listener. That for me, it's not only about first listen is the best listen, but in answer to your question, I think that it does have to, that at the present moment, it does require a lot more, discipline or active choice, active selection on the part of the listener, rather than just like, allowing the next thing in your SoundCloud feed to play.
Yeah, I worry about the mechanic that this autoplay thing maybe will spawn within my own head, and maybe I can feel it a little bit, that listening becomes the anticipation of the next experience rather than an occupation with current listening. It troubles me deeply, but
I don't know. My experience of SoundCloud is that a new track appears, but that I listen to, I tend to listen to something twice, 3 or 4 times, and I don't know. To me, that's part of the experience of recorded sound, of those multiple listens.
Well, David, this has been excellent. Really appreciate you coming on to share these records and the experiences you have attributed to them as well.
Absolutely. My pleasure.
If people want to check out your own projects and what you're up to, where's best for them to be headed?
That's a good question. Go to the fucking record store. No, I make records for Drag City, which is notoriously tight about sharing their stuff. The next record of mine is a record called Creep Mission, which comes out on September 22nd. I don't know. People will find things within like 5 seconds.
Yeah, that's fair.
I don't have a preferred please visit my such and such page. In general, I make albums. I do tend to have this sort of like temporal sweet spot of like 35 minutes. That's, every couple of years I release 35 minutes of music and that works for me. So, I mean, I like for people to experience things as albums. So yeah, find those.
Great. I'll encourage them to do that. Lass's answer was, don't listen to me, go listen to Tony Conrad instead.
Yes.
Which is the alternative, I guess. Once again, David, thank you so much. And to everyone listening, I'll see you very soon.